No conflict in the early Cold War brought the world closer to nuclear war than the Korean War, when a surprise invasion on a Sunday morning in June 1950 escalated into a brutal three-year struggle that saw American forces pushed to the brink of defeat, rescued by one of history's most daring amphibious operations, then driven back again by massive Chinese intervention that nearly destroyed entire divisions in frozen mountain retreats. The war that Americans would later call the Forgotten War killed more than 3 million people, transformed a peninsula into a permanent symbol of Cold War division, and established patterns of superpower confrontation that would shape conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, while ending in stalemate that left both Koreas claiming victory and the border essentially unchanged from where fighting began. At 4 o'clock in the morning on June 25, 1950, North Korean artillery opened fire along the entire length of the 38th parallel, the arbitrary line that had divided Korea into Soviet and American occupation zones after Japan's defeat in World War II. Within minutes, Soviet-built T-34 tanks and North Korean infantry poured across the border at multiple points, catching South Korean forces completely unprepared as most officers were home for the weekend. The invasion, planned in secret for months with Soviet approval and Chinese support, shattered the uneasy peace that had existed since both occupation forces withdrew in 1948, leaving behind rival Korean governments that each claimed the entire peninsula and had been conducting border raids and skirmishes for 2 years. Understanding the Korean War requires examining how Korea, occupied by Japan since 1910, was divided between American and Soviet forces in the chaotic final days of World War II, when both raced to accept Japanese surrender. The 38th parallel, chosen hastily by American military planners using a National Geographic map, was meant as a temporary administrative line, allowing both powers to disarm Japanese forces, with the expectation that Korea would soon be unified under a single government. But as Cold War tensions hardened, both sides established separate Korean states aligned with their ideological systems, transforming the temporary line into a permanent border. In the South, American occupation forces supported Syngman Rhee, a 70-year-old anti-Japanese resistance leader who had spent decades in exile and returned with American backing to establish the Republic of Korea in August 1948. In the North, Soviet forces installed Kim Il-sung, a 33-year-old former guerrilla fighter who had spent World War II fighting Japanese forces in Manchuria as a Soviet army major, and now led the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea, proclaimed in September 1948. Both leaders were fervent nationalists who believed in reunification and were willing to use force to achieve it, conducting border raids and building military forces, while their superpower sponsors withdrew occupation troops. By early 1950, Kim Il-sung was pressing Stalin for permission to invade the South, arguing that South Korean communists would rise up to support northern forces, and that the United States, which had shown little interest in defending Korea and had withdrawn most troops, would not intervene. Stalin was initially reluctant, focused as he was on Europe and unwilling to risk confrontation with the United States. But by early 1950, several factors changed his calculation, including Mao Zedong's communist victory in China and American Secretary of State Dean Acheson's speech in January 1950 that appeared to exclude South Korea from America's defensive perimeter in Asia. In January 1950, Stalin gave his permission for invasion, but made clear the Soviet Union would not intervene directly, leaving Kim to secure Chinese support. Mao Zedong, Flush with victory in the Chinese Civil War and eager to demonstrate communist solidarity, released thousands of Korean veterans who had fought in Chinese communist forces, providing Kim with seasoned troops who would form the core of his invasion force. By June 1950, North Korea had assembled approximately 223,000 troops, including 100,000 border police, 150 Soviet T-34 tanks that South Korea had no weapons capable of stopping, and 132 aircraft, while South Korea could field only 87,500 troops with no tanks and few anti-tank weapons. The North Korean invasion achieved immediate success as T-34 tanks, virtually invulnerable to South Korean weapons, led columns south, while amphibious forces landed on South Korea's coasts to outflank defensive positions. South Korean forces, spread thin along the border with many officers absent for the weekend, collapsed at most points as the speed and violence of the assault overwhelmed unprepared units. Within 3 days, North Korean forces captured Seoul, the South Korean capital, after South Korean commanders prematurely blew bridges across the Han River in a panic, trapping 44,000 South Korean troops on the North Bank and ensuring the capital's fall. The invasion shocked the United States, which had not anticipated attack despite intelligence warnings, and had assured South Korea that America would defend it. President Harry Truman immediately ordered the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait to prevent Chinese Communist forces from invading Taiwan, a move that outraged Mao and convinced him American hostility threatened China directly. Truman then went to the United Nations, which passed a resolution authorizing military intervention to defend South Korea because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council over the UN's refusal to recognize Communist China, and therefore could not veto the resolution. American occupation forces rushed from Japan to Korea, but they were catastrophically unprepared for combat after 5 years of soft occupation duty. Task Force Smith, named for its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, encountered North Korean forces at Pusan on July 5th and was quickly routed when American bazookas could not penetrate T-34 armor and North Korean forces simply bypassed American positions. The 24th Infantry Division, ordered to delay the North Korean advance, was pushed back repeatedly as American units discovered their training emphasized mechanized warfare unsuited to Korean terrain, and that North Korean forces were far more capable than anticipated. By late July, American and South Korean forces had been driven into a small perimeter around the port of Pusan in Korea's southeast corner, the last piece of South Korea not under North Korean control. The Pusan Perimeter became a desperate defensive line as United Nations forces, now including British troops and contingents from Turkey, Canada, and other nations answering the UN call, fought to hold positions against repeated North Korean assaults. American air superiority and the arrival of heavier tanks, including M26 Pershings, helped stabilize the line. But by early September, the situation remained precarious as North Korean forces prepared for a final offensive to push UN forces into the sea. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed commander of all UN forces, believed the key to breaking the stalemate was a bold amphibious landing at Inchon, the port serving Seoul on Korea's west coast, 150 miles behind North Korean lines. The plan was extraordinarily risky because Inchon's extreme tidal variations provided only a 3-hour window for landing on September 15th, and failure would leave forces stranded while North Korea crushed the Pusan Perimeter. Military planners from the Navy and Marines raised numerous objections about tides, seawalls, and the narrow approach channels that would make ships sitting targets, but MacArthur was adamant that surprise and boldness would overcome obstacles. On September 15, 1950, the invasion force struck Inchon in a meticulously timed operation that began with Marines seizing Wulmidu Island in the morning high tide, then assaulting Inchon itself during the evening tide. The landing succeeded brilliantly because North Korean forces, focused on the Pusan offensive, had left Inchon lightly defended and were caught completely by surprise. Within days, American forces captured Inchon and pushed towards Seoul, while simultaneously the 8th Army broke out of the Pusan Perimeter, catching North Korean forces in a massive trap. By September 28th, UN forces recaptured Seoul in brutal street fighting, while North Korean forces attempted a desperate retreat north. The North Korean army, which had come within weeks of total victory, disintegrated as units were cut off and destroyed, with only about 25,000 soldiers making it back across the 38th parallel out of the 223,000 who had invaded. The stunning reversal vindicated MacArthur's daring and transformed him into a hero, while North Korea faced the prospect of complete defeat. With North Korean forces in full retreat, MacArthur and Rhee pressed for permission to cross the 38th parallel and destroy North Korea entirely, arguing that reunifying Korea under a democratic government was the only way to ensure permanent peace. President Truman granted permission, despite warnings from some allies, particularly Britain, that crossing the parallel risked Chinese intervention. American and South Korean forces crossed into North Korea in early October, captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang on October 19th, and pushed rapidly toward the Yalu River that marked the Chinese border. MacArthur dismissed warnings about Chinese intervention, believing that China would not dare attack American forces and that if China did intervene, it would be with small forces easily defeated. American intelligence chief Major General Charles Willoughby reinforced MacArthur's confidence by consistently underestimating Chinese capabilities and intentions, despite mounting evidence that Chinese forces were massing near the border. On October 24th, MacArthur lifted restrictions that had prohibited non-Korean forces from approaching the Yalu, and advance units of the South Korean army reached the river on November 21st, with Korean unification seemingly at hand. On October 25th, Chinese forces struck advancing South Korean units near the Yalu River, and between November 1st and 3rd, they attacked the American 8th Cavalry Regiment near Unsan in devastating night assaults that used bugles, whistles, and human wave tactics to overwhelm American positions. The 1st Cavalry Division lost 1,481 killed, wounded, and captured in fighting that revealed a new enemy had entered the war, but then Chinese attacks mysteriously stopped. MacArthur convinced himself the attacks were limited interventions designed to save face rather than full-scale war, and he ordered a new offensive to begin November 25th that he predicted would end the war by Christmas. On November 26th, the day after MacArthur's offensive began, 200,000 Chinese troops under General Peng Dehuai counterattacked along the entire front in coordinated assaults that demonstrated China had been planning intervention for weeks. Chinese forces had infiltrated into Korea in secrecy, moving at night and hiding during the day to avoid American air reconnaissance, then struck with tactics designed to isolate and overwhelm UN units. The attacks achieved complete surprise and threatened to destroy entire American divisions as Chinese forces cut roads and established roadblocks that trapped UN units. The American 2nd Infantry Division, caught in a Chinese trap near Kunuri, fought through roadblocks in what survivors called the Death Ride, losing 4,500 casualties and most of its equipment in a running battle through Chinese positions. In the east, X-Corps forces advancing toward the Chosin Reservoir suddenly found themselves surrounded by 12 Chinese divisions that had infiltrated undetected into the mountains, cutting off American and British forces from their bases. The battle that followed became one of the most harrowing retreats in American military history, as approximately 15,000 American Marines and soldiers, along with British Royal Marine Commandos, fought their way south from the Chosin Reservoir through sub-zero temperatures and constant Chinese attacks. Task Force Faith, a battalion-sized American unit east of the reservoir, was virtually destroyed in desperate fighting that killed its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, with only 385 of 2,500 men reaching safety. The main Marine force at Hagaru, under Major General Oliver Smith, began a fighting retreat on December 6th through Chinese roadblocks and ambushes, supported by close air support, including napalm strikes and supply drops that kept the column moving. At Funchilin Pass, Chinese forces had destroyed a critical bridge, but Air Force transports paradropped bridge sections that engineers assembled under fire, allowing vehicles to cross. The column reached the port of Hungnam on December 11th, where a massive naval evacuation removed 105,000 UN troops, 98,000 refugees, and thousands of vehicles before demolitions destroyed the port. The sudden reversal shocked American forces and the American public, who had been told victory was imminent, only to see newspapers reporting catastrophic defeats and retreat. The reality was more complex than initial reports suggested, as Chinese forces had not significantly outnumbered UN troops but had achieved tactical surprise and used night attacks, infiltration tactics, and psychological warfare, including bugles and whistles, to create the impression of overwhelming numbers. Many Chinese soldiers were veterans of the Chinese Civil War, fighting with a mix of captured Japanese, American, and Soviet weapons, motivated by genuine belief in their cause and confident after defeating nationalist Chinese forces. By January 1951, Chinese and North Korean forces recaptured Seoul, the fourth time the city had changed hands in 7 months, pushing UN forces south in what appeared to be a complete reversal of fortune. General Matthew Ridgway, who replaced the previous 8th Army commander killed in a traffic accident, implemented new training emphasizing dismounted combat and all-round defense, then launched limited offensives that stabilized the front and recaptured Seoul by March 15th. MacArthur now called for expanding the war to include attacks on China itself, including bombing Chinese cities and potentially using nuclear weapons to create an irradiated barrier along the Yalu River. President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff refused, fearing nuclear escalation and a wider war with the Soviet Union, and were increasingly frustrated with MacArthur's public criticism of administration policy. On April 11, 1951, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination, replacing him with Ridgway in a decision that relieved many UN allies who feared MacArthur's escalatory strategy would trigger World War III. By summer 1951, the war had settled into a stalemate, along lines near the 38th parallel where fighting had begun, with both sides digging elaborate trench systems that increasingly resembled World War I. Peace negotiations began in July 1951, but made little progress, as both sides argued over ceasefire lines, prisoner exchanges, and political questions, while fighting continued along a static front. Chinese forces launched major offensives in April 1951, including the Battle of the Inchon River, where British forces fought desperate defensive actions that blunted Chinese attacks, but neither side could achieve breakthrough. The war now became one of attrition, as both sides fought for tactical advantages that might improve negotiating positions, while casualties mounted in battles for hills with names like Old Baldy, Porkchop Hill, and Heartbreak Ridge. American forces rotated troops home after fixed periods of service, reducing combat experience as new soldiers arrived to replace veterans, while Chinese and North Korean forces kept men in place indefinitely. Air combat intensified as Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters challenged American air superiority, leading to dogfights in MiG Alley along the Yalu River, though UN forces maintained overall air dominance. The key obstacle to peace was prisoners of war, as UN forces held 170,000 Chinese and North Korean prisoners, but surveys revealed only 70,000 wanted to return home, with many fearing execution or persecution. China insisted all prisoners be returned to avoid the humiliation of thousands refusing repatriation, while President Truman remembered how Soviet prisoners had been forcibly returned after World War II and refused to repeat that injustice. The deadlock continued through 1952, as soldiers died in combat along static lines, while negotiators argued. In 1953, several factors broke the deadlock, including the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March, the election of President Dwight Eisenhower, who campaigned on ending the war, and exhaustion on all sides after 3 years of fighting. Eisenhower's administration leaked word that it was considering using tactical nuclear weapons if negotiations failed, though whether this threat influenced Chinese decisions remains debated. In April and May 1953, Chinese forces launched final offensives that gained some ground, but demonstrated they could not achieve breakthrough against prepared UN defenses. On July 27, 1953, negotiators signed an armistice at Panmunjom that established a ceasefire and demilitarized zone along the existing front lines, allowed prisoners to choose whether to return home, and created mechanisms for monitoring the ceasefire. South Korea's Syngman Rhee refused to sign, meaning technically South Korea remained at war with North Korea, but he allowed the ceasefire to proceed under American pressure. When the ceasefire took effect at 10 o'clock that night, soldiers from both sides emerged from trenches to stare at each other across no man's land, with some estimates suggesting Chinese forces had been more numerous than anyone realized. The Korean War killed approximately 37,000 American soldiers, 138,000 South Korean soldiers, an estimated 500,000 Chinese and North Korean combatants, and more than 2 million civilians. The war that Americans called forgotten, nevertheless, shaped the Cold War's trajectory for decades. For the United States, Korea demonstrated that overwhelming military power could not achieve political objectives when nuclear escalation risked World War III. The experience accelerated tactical nuclear weapons development and the strategy of massive retaliation, while proving United Nations collective security could work when Soviet vetoes did not block action. For China, the war established its willingness to challenge American military power and preserve North Korea as a communist buffer state, though at enormous cost. The conflict poisoned Sino-American relations for 2 decades and influenced Chinese support for communist movements throughout Asia, including Vietnam. For Korea, the armistice hardened the 38th parallel into one of the world's most militarized borders, creating permanent division. South Korea eventually transformed into a prosperous democracy, while North Korea evolved into the world's most isolated dictatorship under the Kim dynasty. The war's inconclusive end meant both sides claimed victory, while neither achieved reunification. The forgotten war that never officially ended left Korea permanently divided and created a lasting symbol of Cold War confrontation that continues today. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world. Thanks for watching.